Welcome now to Culture at Work on the Business Radio Network, presented by Crest Insurance, with host Matt Nelson.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Culture at Work in Tucson. Thank you for joining us. I'm Matt Nelson with Crest Insurance Group, and this month I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Paul Melendez from University of Arizona's Eller College of Business. And at Culture at Work in Tucson, really our mission is to, highlight the businesses, the nonprofits, and the community members who have really stood the test of Tucson time. And, Paul, I think what an apropos lead up to you, because you have certainly stood the test of Tucson time. You're a Tucson native, and went to school at the UofA. You're a proud Wildcat, and I know we won't hold our respective choices in universities against one another. But can you tell us a little bit of what was your path to academia and why? You've consulted all over the world, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But why Tucson? Aside from the fact that you grew up here, what made you choose the UofA? What keeps you here? What about Tucson is appealing to you? And what do you think does it speak to anything in the community at a larger level?
Yeah, it's first of all, I just want to thank you, Matt, for having me today, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Native Tucson, both my wife and I probably experienced something similar to a lot of other native Tucsonans. When we were in high school, we were thinking we can't get out of Tucson soon enough. For those of us that stayed for college, for university here at the university and completed, then we started thinking, Tucson's a pretty nice place to be, but more opportunities elsewhere. And if you stayed in Tucson past that point, then you began to realize that, and you might recall this, Matt, Tucson became very popular. We started to see a lot of people move to Tucson. Of course, we saw the housing boom and bust. And then I think at a certain point, I just really began to fully appreciate the quality of life here. I mean, our weather is not only a draw to students, internationally and nationally, but it's something pretty special. And I just love the pace. I love the community. And, for me, I just got really fortunate. I as you said earlier, I did my undergrad and my grad degree, including my PhD at the university. And, typically you then leave, right, for a position elsewhere. And in this instance, I stayed, and I think I was really, really, really fortunate for that. When I was a grad student, I started doing some teaching at Pima Community College, which I did for years, and it was still one of the best experiences I ever had. And I think I've carried some of that learning from teaching at Pima to the university. And I think in terms of ethics education, one of the reasons why I ultimately ended up staying was because, as you might recall, a couple decades ago, we had a rash of corporate scandals. And there were some real active calls, questions about the role of business schools in preparing, undergrads and MBAs to take on leadership roles. And it was right around that time that our dean at the time, Dr. Ken Smith, who was a tremendous mentor to me, called me in and said, "What are we going to do about this?" and I had no ethics training at the time. I did dabble in ethics because of the doctoral work I did on privatization and looking at the ethics of, shifting services from the public to the private sector. But, when the dean called me in and said, "What are we going to do?" And he suggested maybe we should develop our first business ethics course. I remember saying, "That sounds great." I said, "I need about a year." And he said, "You've got about 2 or 3 months." When the dean tells you that, you say, "Okay." And I said, "Well, Dean Smith," I said, "if we're going to do this right, we need to have small classes, 20 plus." He said, "You're going to do 200. You're talking to an economist," he said. "We believe in economies of scale." And so this was incredibly motivating. But, one of the things that not only allowed me to do was to develop the college's first business ethics course, which was now almost 20 years ago. But it allowed me also to get into a really good conversation with our dean about how, if what we were really trying to do, and I think it's important with the title of your talk here, if we're trying to change the culture, right, of our students, a class is a piece, but it's not the end all be all. So what I ended up basically doing was rolling out, if you will, a set of initiatives that I thought in total would really, really help us to institute and to really maintain a culture that would serve our students well, not only as students, but when they went into business and industry. So I think, I backed into this in some regards, but I also had some great leadership. I had some people that believed in me. I took some risks, to be honest with you. And, I think any entrepreneur can probably identify in that way. Even if you're in an academic institution, things sometimes kind of line up. So, our Center for Leadership Ethics, which is really one of the premier centers. I founded that many, many years ago. It's not totally uncommon to have a Center for Leadership Ethics in a business school. But what makes us so different is we not only do research on organizational ethics, we teach students at the undergrad and graduate levels. In fact, some of our PhD students absolutely love this specialty and are beginning to really make some inroads in their own work and taking on leadership roles in universities they go to. But we do a lot of outreach as well. We do programs for high school students, college students, and even executives. And when you look at kind of our mission in that way, that three-legged stool, we're unlike anyone else in the world. And so our little humble Center for Leadership Ethics, which is the only center of its kind in the college or the university, it's got international recognition. I mean, I have faculty from throughout the world reach out many times a year asking, how'd you do this? Can you provide some advice? Would you like to partner? And the answer to all those questions is yes, 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 because they think that, sharing, if you will, especially when it comes to ethics education, is a good thing for all of us, right? I think at the end of the day, the more we can get people to embrace this and to really make commitments, I think not just for business, but for society, we're going to be well served.
I agree with you. It's funny. I think back to an interview that I did with a longtime friend, a local business owner here in Tucson, but also a graduate of Eller, both undergrad and graduate, in the graduate program, in the MBA program. And one of the things that we contrasted a bit was our two different experiences. I did my MBA elsewhere. He did his through Eller here. And one of the things that we talked about, one of the things we both wished that we had spent more time paying attention to, whether it was something that was like a specific class or just part of a curriculum, was the kind of the importance of humility in business. And from that, I think ethics springs from a sense of humility, because you have to have this idea that, you can't just create the rules as you go. Like there's a standard and there is a necessity to kind of humble yourself in front of the standard. And that wasn't something that was, it was something that perhaps came up anecdotally in some of our business curriculum, but both of us said, boy, it would have been, what a great thing to stress in any sort of a leadership development program, right? But then we also talked about it, and he actually was quite complimentary about his experience in kind of this idea of a do the right thing type of approach to business education. And it sounds like that springs forth uniquely here at the University of Arizona, at least, because of the work that you did founding the Center for Leadership Ethics. And so I guess that leads me to a question. I mean, was this something that, I know you said, there were scandals that were going on environmentally, and that kind of precipitated this, maybe, a directive from the dean, but almost like a voluntarily setting forth as an institution that, hey, this is a problem that we want to correct because we feel that this is part of our space in the business community. When you look at society right now, right, and since this month, we're really dialing in on this idea of ethics and ethical decision making, there seems like a rather, if not unique, a rather apparent need for us to revisit some of these ideas about why is ethics important? What are the varying what are the modalities of ethics? How do you standardize ethics so that we wind up in a situation where, we don't keep encountering these things on a crisis basis? Yeah. Has your experience, when you contrast things internationally, is this a uniquely American problem? Is this something you're seeing all over? I mean, what in your experience has been driving this? Because it seems to be more prevalent now than ever.
Yeah, it's a great point you raised, Mark, and I don't believe it's a uniquely American thing, and I'm just going to kind of rattle off a few of the most recent scandals, and I'm not going to go into great detail, but for those of your listeners that pay close attention, to what's happening, not just here, but abroad, some of these are going to sound very familiar, especially anyone that's in the finance or accounting fields. In Germany, for example, you probably have heard of the whole scandal with Wirecard, right? The payment processing company. That is to Germany what Enron was to the US. And what we're finding is just a whole slew of fraud, right? Involving everything from money laundering on up. You can go to China. In China, they have a very large company called Luckin. It's kind of the equivalent to our Starbucks. That has been basically falsifying their earnings for the entire year, right? And because of different accounting and different controls, there have been some issues, but this is still a company that's on our stock exchange, so that's problematic. And then you can go to Brazil, right, where I've been to, and I've been to each of these countries, but Brazil has one of the largest engineering companies called Odebrecht, and they have been just involved in some deep bribery scandals. So, whether we're talking about a company in Germany, a company in China, or a company in Brazil, corporate fraud exists, in all parts of the world. One thing, though, Mark, that you might find very interesting is the culture, though, of each of those countries is very different. For example, in Germany, they look at issues a little bit different than we do. And since I kind of mentioned Enron, I'll give you a great case in point. When Enron broke here, and I'm sure you remember Enron, right? Because I have emblazoned in my memory, those images of the auditors trying to shred those documents before the regulators came in, right? In the US, because we're a very individualistic culture, our first question was, how could the CEO, right? How could the CEO have allowed this to happen? And that's because we're very individualistic. At the very same time, and there's been some researchers that have looked at how Enron was kind of digested in the US and Germany. When the Germans looked at this, they were not looking at this from an individual standpoint. They were a little more collectivistic. They were asking questions like, what is it about the American form of capitalism, right, and its institutions that could have allowed for this to have happened? That doesn't make us better or them worse or vice versa, but because of the different culture, it may be interpreted differently, it may be dealt with differently, but in the end, fraud is fraud, right? And I think that's what kind of that's what we're seeing in all parts of the world. And by the way, as you know, the Wirecard example is just the most recent, right? We've seen Siemens in massive corporates involved in massive corporate fraud. And let's not forget Dieselgate with Volkswagen, right? So I don't think this is a uniquely American thing, but I think, again, the culture of the country and its institutions, and I think that's where you find some difference.
So, and it sounds like, it sounds like you're describing are varying interpretations of kind of this concept of motivational blindness, right? Where it's like, we've got these blind spots that perhaps are cultural. And so when presented with a situation that's an ethical challenge, the things that incent or motivate us within our culture are kind of like the ad hoc justifications we use for something that ordinarily we would say is wrong if we were looking at it from the third party, whereas from the first party, we've got kind of this justification for it inbuilt. So pulling it back to Tucson then, from the international, then when you talk to students in the classroom today, especially with how public so many of these ethical failings are now, are there things that, looking into the next generation, give you hope? Are there things that concern you? What do you think, from a business leaders of the future perspective, are the opportunities and maybe the threats that are kind of arising in the business community?
Yeah. So Matt, the one of the courses I teach, which is obviously very germane to today's discussion, is ethical issues in business. But I also teach international management and courses on innovation. But with this business ethics course, it's a large course. I have a couple hundred students, and here are some observations that I think will kind of go to your point. This generation, unfortunately, has had a lot of experience seeing U.S. corporations, government agencies, and even nonprofits do the wrong thing. Unfortunately, they probably have more examples of failed leadership, failed ethical leadership, than examples of demonstrated ethical leadership. So that's one thing that I'm very aware of. You know, they read papers, they watch the news, you know, they're on social media. So that's one thing. So their perspective can be a little bit jaded. However, here's what's really interesting, Matt, and this is something that people that study generations have noted. The current generation has something in common with, do you remember the baby boomers? The baby boomers were very, and still are, very idealistic. Their ideas about making change and being able to change the world. Current generation is very idealistic. So while their experience with failed leadership is very clear, they're also very idealistic, and they feel that they can make a change, that they can do things different. And it's not a huge surprise for me then when you see a lot of the current generation looking at business and seeing the power and the benefit that business can bring to all of us, but asking the question, is this the only form of business? And so when you think of social enterprises, which I know you're very familiar with, or configurations like benefit corporations, this is the generation that's going to drive that into the future. And for some of us, that are a little bit older, or as I always like to say, a little long in the tooth or a little silver haired, I find this to be immensely exciting. There are others that kind of get very uncomfortable because they say, hey, wait a second, I see business in one particular way, and isn't this kind of a mission match, right? I mean, we got nonprofits over here and government over here, but there are some different, entities that can be formed and different pursuits that businesses can take. And I'm seeing that. And this to me is exciting. I don't see it as much of a threat as much as I see it as a huge opportunity for a new type of business. I have a lot of faith.
That's good to hear. It's exciting. I agree with you. I think the idea of a mission company is something that, as recently as maybe 15 years ago, I mean, you might have, conceptually in HBR or something like that, somebody may have described it, but you see it now where it's, the company is founded with the intent of, for every dollar we make here, we're going to donate $1 here. And that's right. That's the sort of thing that just at a fundamental level, I don't have it in my memory much beyond, like, again, 15 years ago or so. And that is exciting. It's exciting to have this in some way odd pairing of what would ordinarily be like a nonprofit or a for mission type of organization blended into the for-profit space. That's that is exciting.
Well, so, and Matt, for all you mentioned earlier about international, right? I'm just going to share with you one of the most incredible experiences I had that really kind of caught me flat-footed. I took my MBAs to Argentina, probably, I don't know, close to 10 years ago, for not only see the country, sample the culture, but also meet some of the large US-based multinational corporations that have a position in Argentina, but also some Argentinian companies. We got to meet Alejo, who is the co-founder of Tom Shoes. And when he engaged the students, I felt like I could have been listening to a Bill Gates when he was, 20 or 30 years younger. Tom Shoes is, and I'm sure you're familiar with Tom Shoes, is exactly what you just described. It's a business, right? But it's got a unique kind of business model, right? They're not only interested in financial performance, right? They're also interested in kind of their social performance, right? And the things that they feel that they can do and change, at a global level. And so even in a country like Argentina, which has its challenges, we were still able to find this individual that was part of this incredible experiment that we hadn't seen to that point, right? You want to talk about a real disruptor in the marketplace. Tom Shoes was, in my opinion, one of the very, very best examples we can point to. But from a generational standpoint, I think it kind of gets to the appeal and the promise that some of these businesses can hold for the current generations that we're seeing at the university.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and then actually, so you had said something that really stuck out to me, which was the difference in culture internationally, right, across cultures, but really how that correlates to ethics. And then, like we were just talking about, how generationally ethics can vary somewhat. And so I really think that kind of brings us to your book, right? So you wrote a book in 2019, Moral Problems in Management, an Objective Model of Analysis, right? And so textbook, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, what you're kind of speaking to, and correct me if I misinterpreted it, but you're kind of speaking to a sort of an instruction manual for when you're encountering an ethical quandary where maybe people are bringing different cultural tales into it, or different generational interpretations into it, to try and get everybody's lenses to kind of sync up.
Yeah.
And use a systematic approach to dissect a complicated situation, right? As most all ethical, the easy ethical situations, I think pretty much everybody can suss out. But when you get into the things that are tangled, that's where all of a sudden, interpretation matters. So why did you write the book? I mean, certainly you could have just grabbed a book for a class or something like that.
Right.
What made you decide to author it? What did you see as the need?
Yeah, great question. So here's what I realized after many, many years of kind of being in this space. We make decisions every day, multiple times a day, right? We don't even think about it. And in there, we could almost have a separate conversation on the challenges of unconscious bias, right? But we make many, many decisions. Most of our decisions, Matt, I think you would agree, in a business sense, still, if we're not careful, are based on what we think and feel, right? They're very subjective, right? And that's part of being human, we say, right? But the problem is how you think and feel about matters may be totally different than how I think and feel, or different than from how Mark may think or feel. And so that can be a real challenge. So what I sought to do was to develop a model, right, that would not be subjective, but more objective. And so what I settled in on was that there are some criterion, right? What I call stakeholder interests, which are based on inclusive considerations, economic outcomes, which is based on impersonal market forces, legal requirements, which is based on impartial, social and political processes, and then of course ethics, which are based on these indelible universal principles. And my argument has been that if you're a manager or a leader of a firm, and it's not if, it's when you are confronted with an ethical dilemma, instead of deviating to what you think and feel and the challenges that follow, if you can equip yourself with an objective model of analysis that you can get everyone, for the most part, to buy into and say, yeah, it's important to consider the stakeholders, the economic, the legal, and the ethical considerations, that's going to yield, in my opinion, potentially a resolution that's going to be more comprehensive, but also much more likely to engender the support of others that you're going to need to help you address the issue. And so that was the inspiration, really, for the text. I had been teaching this, but I really wanted to find a way also to memorialize it and to kind of run a red thread through not only what I'm teaching, but also what the students are studying. And so that was really kind of the impetus behind this. And the one thing I know that you can identify, that you can relate to, and Mark can as well, is that it doesn't matter if you're in a public or private company. I would even argue if you're a business, government, or nonprofit. And I know you've had all those different professionals from all those different sectors come in. Ultimately, it's a balancing act. When you have an ethical dilemma, it challenges the need for you to balance your financial and social performance, right? Financial performance we can measure in terms of kind of your revenues and your costs and your profits. Social performance is a little more difficult to measure, but you can still determine in terms of like overall stakeholder satisfaction. My sense is that you can't be thinking of it today as an either or. I'm either going to focus on financial performance or social. My sense is you have to do both, and you have to do both financial and social, and you got to be open to the evolution of additional requirements or demands that you're going to have to face, by external stakeholders. So that, at a kind of a high level, was kind of the thinking behind the text. And ultimately, my goal was to equip managers and leaders with a tool that, when used, can really, really help, help you break through with identifying ethical dilemmas and finding a solution.
Well, so I want to dive into the model itself, and we've got a couple of case studies we can talk about. But as we're at the bottom of the hour, I do want to take a quick second. So for those of you who are just joining us, this is Culture at Work in Tucson, proudly presented by Crest Insurance Group. As the largest locally owned and operated insurance brokerage in Southern Arizona and headquartered right here in Tucson, and one of the top 100 insurance agencies in the United States, Crest is your hometown broker to assist with commercial insurance, workers' compensation, and employee health insurance plans. I'm your host, Matt Nelson of Crest Insurance, and now back to our conversation with Dr. Paul Melendez from the University of Arizona's Eller College of Business. So Paul, let's dive into this ethical decision-making model, because the two questions that jump right off the page to me as we talk about how these situations get so tangled. One is, all right, well, regardless of the situation, there have to be some things that are common root causes of unethical behavior, right? And some of those are probably pretty simple to suss out, right? They're probably incentive-based, right? Where it's like, if I make this unethical decision, I personally benefit. My suspicion is that it's perhaps a bit more complicated than that, because as you identified earlier, these large ethical failings involve more than just one person, right? And so when you involve more than just one person, the idea that just, well, one person's going to make money, in my mind, the argument starts to kind of fall apart, right? So when you have done your analysis and you've sat down and looked at this over the years, what are you seeing as kind of the common root causes for unethical behavior?
So the accounting profession, specifically forensic auditing, has given us a great gift. And that is, to me, kind of the three drivers behind, the root causes of all kind of unethical behavior. And Matt, I know that you and I have had conversations, and boy, we could probably spend 3 hours just on this one. But for our audience, every financial crime has these three drivers. There's motivation, opportunity, and rationalization, right? Motivation's not bad. It's just a pressure or a need for something. Opportunity, the way I like to describe it, is the door that kind of meets that motivation. Now, when we get to rationalization, that's where it gets to be a little bit different, right? This is when we're about to do something that we know is on the margins, but we tell ourselves, right? Everyone else is doing it, right? I'm doing this because things are so unfair, or that, I'm not really hurting everyone. When all three of those come together, you have, in effect, the perfect storm, and you can almost guarantee that you're going to have problems. And I see this on campus with both undergrad and grad students, right? They're highly motivated to earn good grades. They get opportunities to cut corners, right? Whether it's turning in a paper from a paper mill or cheating on an exam. And they can rationalize it, saying, hey, you know what? Everyone else is doing it, right? Doesn't change the fact that it's still wrong. And guess what? That also applies to the business community, right? And businesses. And I know that in the past, you have had Aaron Bean, who used to be the CFO of Health South. I actually did, back when it was kind of a new thing, a YouTube interview where I asked him about motivation, opportunity, and rationalization. And he gave it to me straight, right? His motivation was to meet quarterly earnings. His opportunity as a CFO was I was thinking there was going to be some grandiose mark-to-market accounting like Enron. He said, no, you're just accelerating the recognition of revenues, and you're just deferring the recognition of expenses. His rationalization was incredible, though. Basically, he said, I was under enormous pressure from the CEO at the time, Richard Scrushy. There were a lot of other CEOs at the time that were doing this practice, and there is some truth to that, because we can look back and see other companies engaging in that type of fraud. But the other one that was fascinating, Matt, was that he said, look, all of us lived in this small community, which was the headquarters for Health South. I grew up with these people. Our kids went to school together. I'd run into them at the supermarket or church. If I had done what a CFO should do, which was good old-fashioned belt tightening, I would have had to have laid people off. And these are just hardworking people, and I couldn't bring myself to do that. So you asked the question, and I think that at the end of the day, it's when those three drivers or those three factors are all working in unison that you can almost guarantee that you're going to have problems.
So, and that coming from an aviation background, that Swiss cheese model of accident analysis, right? When the holes all line up, that's when the failure happens.
Yeah.
So that kind of calls into question, like, what should our limiting factors be then? Where do we get to black and white? Is it, if something is legal, for example, placing all of the onus on the regulators, right? Where you say, hey, look, GAAP standards are the firewall that's going to keep these types of financial games from being able to occur. We're going to remove the opportunity because we're going to say these standards are the way that everything has to happen. And you know as well as I do that the second you put together a standard, you've got 100 people who are really smart looking at that standard and finding ways to poke at it and find ways around the edges. So, I mean, can we as a society pass that ethical responsibility, that ethical firewalling off to regulators, or do you feel that that is something, and I suspect I know the answer, but do you think that that's something that's sustainable, or are there other things that should be guiding us? Because to your point, his rationalization was, I'm taking care of just a different type of stakeholder. You know, I'm failing my shareholders with and my investors with inaccurate financial reports, but I'm doing so to benefit another group of shareholders. So I guess, can you blend those two ideas into what you think about the situation?
Well, I'll give it my best. I'll give it my best shot. So here's what's really interesting about, and you might recall earlier, Matt, when I described the objective model analysis, one of the key considerations is legal requirements. And, you know, for all of our imperfections, I'm still incredibly bullish on America and our ability to kind of rise to the occasion. With that being said, we've got challenges, right? Here's what I've noticed historically, and tell me if you agree. We typically have to have a market failure in order for people to get hurt, you know, God forbid die, or get so incensed that they then begin to put enormous pressure on our elected officials, which then begin the long, arduous process of having new laws and regulations, right? And we've seen this play out, right? It doesn't matter if it's a pharmaceutical company, an aviation company, or, you know, an extraction company. The problem is that it's always reactionary, okay? And that can be a concern. And the other thing is, our laws are still, there can be problems with our laws in terms of our norms. So this is something that I know you're aware of, that I always like to point out, because we change. It may take time, but we change. You know, one time in American history, it was legal to own slaves. At one time in American history, it was legal to deny women the right to vote. Right? At one time in American history, we could separate kids from, you know, by schools, you know, through segregation based on the color of skin. Now, when I share this with people today, we all say, wow, but that's in the past. And I also say, well, that was also legal at the time. So we also have to be aware that sometimes there can be a lag, right, between our laws and kind of our morals and our standards. So look, my sense is that laws represent kind of a minimal base, a minimal standard that we can all accept. And that's important. But to me, ethics is about so much more, right? There's nothing legally that says that Matt needs to donate, right? That's a choice. Now, if you decide that you want to donate to a charitable, cause, I would say that's a great thing, right? I mean, there's lots of benefits to go around, but I think laws set kind of a minimal standard, but I think that ethically, there's a lot of space. There's more that we can do. And I think we had talked a little bit about this. I get asked this question time and time again, what's the difference between morals and ethics? They seem to be kind of the same. And I say, well, good point, right? Morals are kind of standards of behavior and ethics are systems of belief. And they say, well, that's a really simple way of looking at them. And I said, yeah, but they're a little bit different when you have to apply them. And they said, well, give me an example. I said, okay, let me give you an example. Let's say that, this weekend, Matt, I'm walking down University Boulevard and I see you at Froggenfergen, for example, and you're smoking a cigarette. And I say, Matt, that's immoral. And you say, what are you talking about? The whole act of you behaving in the way that you're smoking. You say, well, what's wrong? What's immoral about that? Because it goes against my ethics. You say, well, what do you mean? Well, I don't think that you should do anything that could harm you or other people, right? That's how morals and ethics can converge, right? They are different, but they're also related. And so, since you asked the question about law, which is also connected to morality and ethics, I thought I'd try to kind of pull those together.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think it creates an interesting object lesson that actually ties to a case study that I want to talk to you about, because it's one that I've had the privilege of hearing you dissect in the past. Mm-hmm. Because, I could come from my own ethics and say, well, all right, but I'm smoking a cigarette, and that's something that I have agency, and I've decided that it's not inconsistent with my ethical view of the world that I could do something that perhaps is self-harming, right? Because
That's right.
it's myself that I'm harming. So when we and for the matter, I don't smoke, but but you could play devil's advocate, right? So.
Sure.
So let's take this case study, and this is a case that I know you and I have talked about a couple of times, and it's such a fascinating object lesson. And again, being somebody with an aviation background, I find it really interesting, and that is this contemporary example of the Boeing 737 MAX, right, and the couple of crashes that really stemmed from, and if I miss any of this, please correct me, but essentially, the key ethical issue that seems to spring forth here is you had the Boeing 737, which is an airframe that had a great safety record. It's a company that has a great safety record. It's kind of one of those American Titan companies, right? It's like the Boeing Corporation. And so what Boeing did was they used this airframe, which was an approved airframe, made some changes to it so that they could sell some new airplanes. And in doing so, part of those changes were they upgraded the avionics and control systems. And for those who are listening who are not aviation folk, the systems in issue were called the MCAS system, which is it's a software system that detects when the airplane is in a state of flight where it's going to stall and it's going to lose its aerodynamic profile. And so the system is designed that when that stall happens, which is generally the airplane is losing forward speed, the nose is up, it loses lift. And so the MCAS system kicks in and causes the airplane to nose down and regain controlled flight, right? So they put this new software in there, but what they didn't want to do was they didn't want to have to go through the process of recertifying a whole new airframe. And really more importantly, because it would have been an obstacle to selling these aircraft, they didn't want to create this extended training pipeline for pilots that would be required when you make a new, like if you were to roll out an entirely new airplane, you'd have this long training pipeline for pilots and simulators and things like that. And that becomes unappetizing for an airline because they've got this downtime in addition to the capital cost of buying the planes. Is that a fair synopsis of the situation?
It's more than fair. If I could give you a grade, I'd give you an A, Matt. That's exceptional. Yes.
Well, thank you. So, and as anybody who watched the news saw, the really tragic consequences of this is that there were a couple of extremely deadly crashes with this airframe where the autopilot commanded the airplane into the ground. Essentially, the pilots became disoriented because there was a missing gauge in the in the dashboard that would have told them that what was happening wasn't really happening. They got disoriented. The planes crashed into the ground, and lots of people lost their lives. And then Boeing became embroiled in this massive ethical scandal that involved failings of government regulators. It involved failings of their engineers and subsequent tell-alls. And then there's the executives and the profit motives. So when you look at that situation and your ethical framework for decision-making, your model for ethical decision-making, I'm sure there are 100 things that we could point to as to why all of the holes lined up on the Swiss cheese. The two that jump off the page to me that seem most puzzling, because the executives wanting to sell more airframes makes sense, right? That part I can logically impute a rationalization for it.
Yeah.
The part that I struggle with are the failure of the engineers to speak out when they saw something that was a flight critical problem. Yeah. And the other part that really seems very strange to me is the willingness of regulators to go along with this kind of ad hoc rationalization of these systems don't seem like major upgrades. So if I've missed anything outside of those two, let me know. But what are your thoughts as you look at kind of those? Because I think those pretty clearly poke holes in this idea that we can just hold one person accountable, right? This failure happened at multiple levels.
Yeah, and back to your kind of theme, right, with culture, right? It's Boeing has cultures, right? I'm sure If you work for Boeing, you would say, if you're in the HQ, there's a culture, but if you're out at one of the manufacturing facilities, yeah, there's that culture, but there's another culture. But, Matt, tell me if you agree, right? This, like so many other, what I like to call on the Richter scale, 8 or 9 events with, on the Richter scale, which are massive, right? It can not only be a matter of people getting hurt or lives being lost, it could be wholesale industries or economies that can really be shaken. We're still learning, right? It's still evolving. But to your first point about the engineers, I really, really, really wonder, and I wonder at what point we find out if we do. What did the engineers do, right? Because we've seen in American history, right? This is one of the other cool things about what I get to do is I get to approach it from a historical perspective. For some of the listeners, they're going to say, "Wow, now he's really reaching back." But you remember the Ford Pinto case with the exploding,
the exploding gas tank. Yep.
That's right. Those engineers called it out, and they came up with a really cost-effective solution. The problem was Ford had done a benefit cost analysis and said, okay, look, the retrofit is going to cost this much if we don't do anything, and we still know that we could have some property damage, people could get hurt, and people might die. Is this amount? Guess what they did? They went and they chose not to do anything. NASA, right? Think about the Challenger and those engineers that called out the problem with the O-ring, right? Hey, look, there's a potential flaw, right? And if it gets cold enough, I didn't even realize it could freeze, quite frankly, in Cape Canaveral. I felt really ignorant. I thought, can it really freeze in Florida? But I don't mean to make light of it, but they called this out. They brought it to the attention of management. What did management do? Very similar to Ford Pinto. I don't know if they engaged in the benefit cost. I think in that instance, there was so much pressure, right? If you recall, with the Challenger, there were hopes about privatizing, space flight, and NASA had a few losses and setbacks. They really had a series of delays, so they needed to make that work. I wonder, Matt, if we really, really, really got deep into the organization, what did those engineers know? Who did they tell? What did they propose? And what happened with that? That's a question that I think about as well. I wish I had more answers, but I think that's gonna glean interesting insights into the culture of the company. Now, you mentioned the regulators, right? The FAA. Look, regulation is really. I'm fascinated with regulation. I think I may have shared with you that when I did my doctoral work, I actually did it on privatization, right? So let's take a hard look at different services that are provided, and is the private sector a better place for this, right? And to be honest with you, regulation is one of those topics that can either get people cheering or get people jeering, right? If, for example, you and I go out and eat dinner and we get sick, and it's because we find out that, there has been no oversight or regulation of how the restaurant is, preparing or sourcing certain types of chicken. You and I are going to be screaming at the top of the lungs, where the hell is the regulation, right? We need regulation. We need food safety, right? Well, on the same token, if we get that regulation, and that adds to costs, right? Which then gets passed on to us, and we start complaining, saying, hey, look, businesses should be able to do this on their own. It's in their own self-interest, right? Regulation makes the markets less efficient, right? And makes things more expensive. With the US mail, right? Postal service, right? When the mail person brings your mail, right? Maybe you get excited because it's a check, maybe a stimulus check. Maybe you get really disappointed when it's your taxes, right? We're very, very fickle, but with the FAA, specifically in the case with the Boeing 737 MAX, there was a lot going on at that time. For one thing, I know, in fairness to the FAA, their budget and their manpower, if you will, had been shrunk. Because Boeing was Boeing, right? And was just the darling of the aviation industry. Those engineers, were quite frankly dawning also as FAA regulators. They were trusted to the extent that they had not only the technical expertise, but the vested interest to make sure that these systems were safe. And so I think there was a lot of lax regulation, but like anything else, like you said, Matt, I think that there are some underlying causes for that, right? Which go beyond just the FAA. These are kind of bigger, kind of philosophical discussions that we need to have, that we're probably having now with changes of administrations of the role of government, right? And so those 2 points that you've called out, I think are really, really, really fascinating. And in there lies some of the explanation, but they're explanations, right? You don't have a catastrophe of this magnitude with a single actor, like you said, right? There's lots of failures that occurred at different points.
Well, it kind of seems like, as a leader, because the other thing that, and for those listening, I'm kind of cheating because I've had the opportunity to listen to this presentation before, but as a leader at, let's say, Boeing, right? It's almost incumbent upon you, by virtue of your role, like you are, in a lot of ways, your job is to go around and search for those motivational blind spots, right? Mm-hmm. And in areas where, because one of the explanations that I heard was, well, from an executive level, we were trying to move aircraft, and at the executive level, we didn't know that this was going to be a problem. We didn't think that a pilot would get disoriented when the MCAS system kicked in, because they'd been flying 737s for years. And as such, that's the justification that we provided to the FAA as to why this wasn't a major change. And of course, in my mind, the immediate question, and this just comes from somebody who, again, I was a crew chief in the aviation crew chief in the Army for 9 years, is, anything that you don't know, it's incumbent upon you to ask, right? So it's like, were the pilots consulted as stakeholders in this? Yeah,
and I think there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that, because, as you know, Matt, because of your experience, putting pilots into flight simulators, it's fun. It's also very expensive. And one of the things that Boeing did with its airline carriers was make a lot of promises about how the 737 MAX was going to be easy peasy, right? It's just like the 737, except it's just bigger and faster and more fuel efficient. And here's the upside, right? No extra training. I think there have been pilots that have said, and when were you going to tell us about this? And not only that, Matt, but I think you would agree, it also became clear that there were some, how shall I say, upselling that could have been done by Boeing to make sure that there were some systems that you could purchase as part of the 737 MAX that would have essentially provided the assurances, the security that you need to with the AOA, right? That could have alleviated all of this. So that's hugely problematic. Matt, the other thing that I wanted to share with you that I think is a real serious discussion that gets to governance. If you recall, as this whole scandal unfolded, and the CEO that was in charge at the time, at some point he was stripped of an interesting dual role that he had. Do you remember? He was CEO and chair of the board of directors.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So for me, Matt, the other thing that really, really, really kind of smacks of a real serious discussion about governance is that really the best thing to do, right? Because if you think about it, I don't want to rationalize for the CEO and the chair of the board, but for someone like me that's more of a purist, I see the CEO having responsibilities for the day-to-day, right? And I've served on boards just like you have, both corporate and nonprofit, et cetera. And then you have the board of directors, and that board of directors, depending on configurations, have one employee. It's usually the CEO. And I think it kind of begs the question, with a company as large as Boeing was, with its tradition and its history and its success that you cited, was that a little bit much for one person? I mean, where were the other directors, right? What were the shareholders saying? Because this was something that probably, in my humble opinion, should have been really seriously evaluated even before any of this transpired, just for the sheer fact that there's alternative configurations, and there's good reasons why you may want to have your CEO focus on the day-to-day and let your board of directors and your chair focus on that kind of high level 30,000 foot, strategic oversight, of the company and where it's going. That in and of itself, I think, also plays into part of the problem that we saw with Boeing.
It's interesting. It's, in a financial circle, I mean, the topic of dual control is, it's like that's finance 101, right? But in a leadership circle, it's a lot more permissive that you could have one person who has control of both levers, the oversight level and lever and the execution lever.
That's right.
And unfortunately, it's like so many rules that where the failure happened, they're written in tragedy. When all of a sudden you look at that and you say, well, obviously having control of both of those levers was a bad idea. We should have had somebody else looking at it. And yet we find ourselves in similar situations often.
Matt, I mean, maybe this is a topic for another podcast at some point, but, it kind of begs the question, right? I mean, I don't want to change gears here, but I think we're all familiar with what happened with Theranos, right? Mm-hmm. And, one of the things and I wrote a case on Theranos, which we can talk about at some other point, even if you've watched the documentary, right? When you looked at the board of directors for Theranos, the one thing that jumped out at me was you had too much of the same. You had too many former government officials or high-level, high-ranking military officials. And this is a high-tech scientific company, right? That's in the business of medicine. And what jumped out at me was that board of directors didn't seem to be representative. And I'm not talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has its own merits. I'm talking about having a board that has such a composition that has the right people, right, with the right skill sets. It was missing. And I have to wonder, right, if we were to look a little bit more carefully at Boeing or other companies from a governance standpoint, not just, separating the roles of the chair and the CEO, but also who's on that board, right? Because we might sit here and say, and Matt, you might say, well, let's get all pilots there, right? For good reason, right? And I might come back and say, let's get all engineers there, right? And for good reason, we might agree that those are two both important parts. But I'll tell you what, for Boeing being what it is, that board should have a composition of a lot of different interests, perspectives, generations, backgrounds, because that's where the good stuff happens, right? You need those contrarians. You need those people at the end of the day that are not being gadflies for the sake of being provocative, but honestly, if I'm not an engineer, asking you as an engineer point blank, is this safe? Like, explain this to me in non-scientific terms, right? And you need those types of really healthy types of discourse and conversations for the good of the company, right? For the good of its shareholders and the broader stakeholders.
So one of the things I always try to do, as we get to where we've got about 5 minutes left or so, for people who are listening, here in Tucson and they're running their business, right? Or they're running their nonprofit, or maybe they're serving on a board. I always try to kind of bring it home with this idea, with a couple of tangible things that are related to the high level things we've been discussing. And, 3 questions kind of jump out based on the conversation we've had. One, and I think, again, I might already know the answer based on what you've said thus far, but, if I'm hiring people and I'm trying to develop them, is it possible to teach a person how to be ethical? Do I have to just get lucky and just be really good at hiring, right? Which is a challenge in and of itself. Or do you think as a business owner, perhaps the greatest use of my effort is to try and hire right, try and have a coherent ethics, but really build my company out like a Henry Ford model where I'm engineering the process to address perhaps the shortcomings that people might individually encounter, and that board construction and things like that fall into that. If you were running Paul Melendez Incorporated, what would that look like? Where would you choose to focus your efforts?
So at the end of the day, I'm an educator, and I firmly believe that in the power of teaching and learning. So I'll take a page out of Aristotle's book, right? Because Aristotle, had this kind of debate in Athenian society like over 2,500 years ago. And his belief was that Ethics was a matter of knowing right from wrong, and that was something that you could be taught, right? And we hope that that teaching begins early on, with the family unit. And I know family can mean different things today, but at the end of the day, that's where you get the people are not born, and I think you would agree, Matt, they're not born with values or ethics or morals, right? You learn those, and you learn those from your family, or you don't. But I believe that from an organizational standpoint, and this maybe gets to your second point, it's really important for organizations, big or small, public or private, to have those values clear. When people know what you stand for, and when you are very clear in terms of what you believe in, how you're going to purport yourself, and your core essence of who you are, and those have ethical overtones, that's very, very powerful. And it signals who you are, and it gives the person who's going to work for you the opportunity to decide if that's what they want, if they're compatible. And from a leadership standpoint, I think it's really simple. I think leaders have to not only focus on telling people what they have to do, right? We can get really stressed and say, Matt, I need you to do this, and don't ask me why. Actually, I think the best leadership is a combination of not only telling people what they have to do, but why. The why, to me, is that critical piece that misses sometimes. If I tell you what you have to do, but why you have to do it, now you understand where you are in the supply chain, and now you have a different appreciation. But if I also tell you why you're going to do it, and how I expect you to do it, right, in an above deck way, in a way that doesn't cut corners, that sets a very powerful tone. Had those conversations happened, Matt, with a company, let's come back to American business, right? Company like Wells Fargo, right? All these people that work for the company that had really ambitious targets and goals, and here's what you need to accomplish. Had the same concern been given to telling them why it's important to do it the right way, that you don't want to cut corners, we don't want to lose customers, we don't want to do harm, we certainly don't want to get into the crosshairs of Congress or federal regulators, things could have been very different. So the other thing is, from a leadership standpoint, focusing on the what and the why, making sure that your values are very clear, and having this inherent belief that people can learn ethics, and sometimes you need to reteach and you need to reorient. So I hope that answered your questions.
It does, thank you. And with that, the one thing I do want to invite people to do is if you want to see Paul's model, the book is Moral Problems in Management, an Objective Model of Analysis. Paul, one of the things you talked about was at the university, you've been extremely generous in my experience going out and sharing your expertise with various organizations around the city. If somebody, a business owner or something, is listening right now and they wanted to learn more about the center, maybe get involved, how would they best do that? How do they best find you and find your staff?
Reach out to me. I will share my email. Let me tell you, I would love nothing more than to get some response. I love to bring business professionals into the classroom to share their experiences. I love to tap into their experience as judges with competitions. I love to include them with kind of high-level thinking. Our next executive ethics symposium this summer, Matt, which I'm going to extend you and Mark and all of your podcast participants in Crest, I'm going to extend you an invitation. We're going to be looking at the ethics of telecommuting or remote work, like what we have now been realizing, right? How do you maintain a culture that's now gone, remote, that was predicated on in-person? How do you motivate people, right, to come back to work, right, instead of doing it from home? How do you measure performance, right? In this remote environment, maybe Mark is thriving and you're struggling. And what does that mean when we come back in person? If we do, if it's ever going to be the same, right? So I want to also share with you that we have invitations we'd like to extend your listeners to be part of as part of our center's mission, opportunities to come in and engage our undergrad students, as judges and share experience, or just come into the classroom and share with us what you know. Students love that. And they can listen to me all day. They don't have much of a choice, right? But when I can get a guest speaker or somebody that's been in business to share with them what they've learned, it's a great thing for all of us, because we all end up benefiting, because these are our future business leaders. So that's an open invitation on all three fronts.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. So for all of you who have been listening, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us for another month here at Culture at Work in Tucson, presented by Crest Insurance. Dr. Melendez, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And thank you to Tucson Business RadioX and my producer, Mark Bishop, who does a fantastic job. This is Matt Nelson at Culture at Work in Tucson. We'll catch you next month. Have a great day, everybody.
Join Matt for another interesting Culture at Work podcast right here on TucsonBusinessRadioX.com.